to do.
A black man saying I'm not black, I'm Hispanic. Daily this is heard in the USA. It clearly shows brainwashing could work like magic to push black people further apart each day. The term Hispanic is now a norm in government, schools, and every form. Awake, my people, open your eyes. I say it's high time you realize nationality is not race. Your ancestry, you must trace. Your race is African, Caucasian, Mongolian, under one nation. Always be proud of your native land. Speaking your language, I think is grand. But please, I beg, don't misunderstand. As long as you're black, you of African nationality. Nationality. Nationality is not race. Nationalidad. Nacionalidad. Nacionalidad. No exception. I know the term Hispanic deals with a country, but pigmentation denotes your race. They may tell you different, but friend, believe me, it's so very simple for you to trade. A white man remains a Caucasian here. Mongolians, you say, meet them anywhere. Why should we of African descent be separated by government? Nationality is not race. Your ancestry, you must trace. Your race is African, Caucasian, Mongolian, under one nation. Always be proud of your native land. Speaking your language, I think is grand. But please, I beg, don't misunderstand. As long as you're black, you of African nationality. Nationality. Nationality is not race. Nacionalidad. 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 No es raza. They always state quite clearly blacks and Hispanics. To me, that is highly ridiculous. One could see quite clearly it causes conflict. A brother black like me, yet not one of us. They never say Hispanic, Caucasian, or Hispanic of African descent. It's blacks and Hispanics, big separation clearly strengthens my argument. Nationality is not race. Your ancestry, you must trace. Your race is African, Caucasian, Mongolian, under one nation. Always be proud of your native land. Speaking your language, I think is grand. But please, I beg, don't misunderstand. As long as you're black, you of African nationality. Nationality. Nationality is not race. Nacionalidad. Nacionalidad. No exception. I know the term Hispanic deals with a country, but pigmentation denotes your race. They may tell you different, but friend, believe me, it's so very simple for you to trade. A white man remains a Caucasian here. Mongolians, you say, meet them anywhere. Why should we of African descent be separated by government? Nationality is not race. Your ancestry, you must trace. Your race is African, Caucasian, Mongolian, under one nation. Always be proud of your native land. Speaking your language, I think is grand. But please, I beg, don't misunderstand. As long as you're black, you of African nationality. Nationality. Nationality is not race. Nationalidad. Nacionalidad. Nacionalidad. No es raza. They always state quite clearly blacks and Hispanics. To me, that is highly ridiculous. One could see quite clearly it causes conflict. A brother black like me, yet not one of us. They never say Hispanic, Caucasian, or Hispanic of African descent. It's blacks and Hispanics, big separation. Clearly strengthens my argument. Nationality is not race. Your ancestry, you must trade. Your race is African, Caucasian, Mongolian, under one nation. Always be proud of your native land. Speaking your language, I think is grand. But please, I beg, don't misunderstand. As long as you're black, you of African nationality. Nationality. Nationality is not race. Nacionalidad. 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 No es raza.
Greetings from TNT. I am Tigress.
This is the original dance master.
This is Marshall Montano.
I'm Brother Valentino.
This is Marcia Miranda.
Caribbean Inside. Yes, I watch them all the time. They're bad.
Caribbean Inside. Really is dynamite. Caribbean Inside. Really super. Was spiked. Caribbean Inside.
Oh, another evening. Good evening and welcome to Politics 101. David Adams here on a Friday evening. It's Friday already. Good evening to you. Please share the link. Let everyone know Politics 101 is on. We come on tonight with a song by the Mighty Duke, Kelvin Pope. Nationality is not race. I think it's pertinent for us in Guyana, especially for African Guyanese. I don't think the other ethnic groups suffer from that thing. When it comes to Amerindians, we don't even use the term Amerindians anymore. Indigenous people. Indigenous people. Very clear about their identity. Very clear about their identity. Very clear about it. Very clear about their identity. We Africans tend to get it a little bit mixed up. Let's hear a little bit more from the Mighty Duke.
For that. Because we need the people, the artists who sing songs given to them.
Say it's high time you realize nationality is not race. Your ancestry, you must trace. Your race is African, Caucasian, Mongolian, under one nation. Always be proud of your native land. Speaking your language, I think is grand. But please, I beg, don't misunderstand. As long as you're black, you of African nationality. 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 Nationality is not race. Nationality. 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 No, sir. I know the term Hispanic deals with a country, but pigmentation denotes your race. They may tell you different, but friend, believe me, it's so very simple for you to trade. A white man remains a Caucasian here. Mongolians, you say, meet them anywhere. Why should we of African descent be separated by government? Nationality is not race. Your ancestry, you must trace. Your race is African, American, Caucasian, American, Mongolian, under one nation. Always be proud of your native land. Speaking your language, I think is grand. But please, I beg, don't misunderstand. As long as you're black, you of African nationality. Nationality. Nationality is not race. Nationality. 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 No es raza. They always state quite clearly blacks and Hispanics. To me, that is highly ridiculous. One could see quite clearly it causes conflict. A brother black like me, yet not one of us. They never say Hispanic, Caucasian, or Hispanic of African descent. It's blacks and Hispanics, big separation clearly strengthens my argument. Nationality is not race. Your ancestry, you must trade. Your race is African, American, Caucasian, American, Mongolian, under one nation. Always be proud of your native land. Speaking your language, I think it's grand. But please, I beg, don't misunderstand. As long as you're black, you of African nationality. Nationality. Nationality is not race. Nationality. 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 No es raza.
Greetings from TNT. I am Tigress.
This is the original dance master.
Oh, yes, the mighty Duke there, the mighty Duke, giving us some education there, some education. Nationality is not race, and I was saying, we in Guyana, especially African Guyanese, we tend to get it confused between our Guyanese-ness and our Africanness. I don't think the other ethnic groups have that confusion. As I was saying, Amerindians, we are no, Amerindians is not even the term, no, we have to say indigenous people. Their identity, their cultural identity. Indians, I don't think East Indians ever had that confusion. You know, their religions and so on doesn't allow them to lose sight of their origins. We Guyanese, we African Guyanese are the ones that tend to be confused. We say we're not African, we're Guyanese, you know? And what the mighty Duke is explaining to us there, nationality is not race. Guyanese is a civic identity. It's an identity that comes out of us sharing the same space. Africans, Indians, indigenous people, Chinese, Portuguese, we come together in this civic space. This civic space, you know, we share the same government, we share the same constitution, same boundaries. But you know, you can stop being Guyanese. You know, you move to France and you take out French citizenship. You become a Frenchman. You're no longer Guyanese. You know, so Guyanese is civic. You know, it's civic, and that's what the Mighty Duke is trying to say there. And you may ask, well, what does it matter in a place like the United States? You notice he was talking about Hispanics. Some Hispanics take off Hispanics, and they're not counted as African Hispanic people, African Mexican or Africans from Panamanian. And funds are disbursed based on ethnicity, funding for school districts, and so on, are based on ethnicity. That is why America does an ethnic count. And in some regards, the more you are represented in the census, the more funds come to your school district and so on, right? And I am anticipating that at some point in Guyana, given our increase in wealth, the question of distribution of wealth, as you notice, the conversation is already heating up. And the government is trying to push back against the ethnic distribution of wealth. You see? And there's a reason they're trying to do that. Because it's a way of avoiding equitable distribution. So they're avoiding the ethnic distribution of wealth like the plague, because it has consequences for who gets what and how much. And so it's incumbent upon us African Guyanese to begin, like the other ethnic groups, to embrace our ethnic identity, our cultural identity, because it's going to mean something going forward. Those monies that are going to the Amerindians, the indigenous people in the interior, it's because of their ethnicity. That money is not coming to the rest of us, all the carbon credits and all. And you notice the PPP trying to thief the people money. And we've been making the argument that the Amerindians have kept the hinterland pure. All that environmental purity. We have to thank the Amerindians for not raping our interior. And we have to thank Africans for civilizing our coast. And at some point, compensation has to come for that. So, apart from avoiding our identity crisis, we must embrace our Africanness so as to avoid that identity crisis that other ethnic groups don't have generally. Or put it another way, we tend to suffer from it more than other ethnic groups. And it messes with the way we see the world and the way we see ourselves and the way in which people can trick us. But apart from that, as wealth increases in Guyana, as it is in the United States of America and those big countries, the question of access to that wealth becomes important, ethnic access. Even a place like the United States, a capitalist country, had to come to grips with ethnicity and distribution of resources. And we are going to get there. So it's important that we understand these concepts. Good evening and welcome to Politics 101. Tonight we're going to be talking something serious. during the emancipation conversations, the issue of exactly the distribution of resources came up. The distribution of economic resources, the distribution of political resource. Political resource, of course, is the government. The government manages the state. The government is in charge of distribution of resources. And at present, that political resource is controlled by one party exclusively. And in our ethnic situation, that party represents the interests mostly of one ethnic group. That party got 50.odd%, not even 51% of the vote, according to the declared numbers. Yet that party holds on to 100% of the government, which means it holds on to 100% of the political resource. And because of that, it then has 100% control over the distribution of the economic resource. And so Nigel Hughes put on the table again the question of the distribution of political resource. You all with shared governance and power sharing, and again, we attach all kinds of meanings to it. But what it means simple is that there is something called political resource. And the highest form of political resource is the government. And you control the government, you control 100% of that vital resource. 100% of the decision making about who gets what, when, and how economically. So you have 100% political power and 100% of the power to determine who gets how much economically. So when Sidney King, in 1961, as a representative of a group called the African Society for Racial Equality, raised the question going into independence about the resources, he says, look, we're looking down the barrel. It looks as though we're going to fight for this political resource because independence is coming. And he came up with what was a novel idea then. He said, why don't we share it? He called it joint premiership. He said, let me split the prime ministership in two. Let me have a joint prime ministership. At that time, it was Dr. Jagan and Mr. Burnham. Of course, it was a novel idea, and neither of the two parties warmed to the idea. When, in 1963, it became clear to Dr. Jagan that he was going to be pushed out of power, he then sought to embrace it. And he offered the PPP, the PNC, a deal. The PNC is going to get the Home Affairs Ministry, and they're going to ding it, and so on, and so on, and so on. By that time, Mr. Burnham and the PNC knew that they were going to get into power. So they tell Dr. Jagan where to get off. But as we came through the years, both parties have paid lip service to the whole idea. The WPA came in the 1970s, embraced the idea. The PPP embraced it while they were in opposition twice. In 1977, they offered something called the National Patriotic Front. The PNC said no. Then in 1985, the two parties began to talk about sharing power. Unfortunately, Mr. Burnham died, and Mr. Hoyt did not continue it. Dr. Jagan said when he got into power, he would embrace it. He called it the Mandela formula. When he got into power, he changed his mind. Then a group of younger people in the PNC began to warm to the idea. And they began to put pressure on Mr. Hoyt. And in 2002, at the PNC's Congress, Mr. Hoyt declared for power sharing. He said power sharing is an idea whose time has come. So the PNC, for the first time, officially adopted the idea that power in Guyana cannot be held by one party and one race. For Guyana to move forward, it has to be shared. The PPP then said, no, no. And they found all kinds of excuses. The APNU ran on power sharing. They had to. The APNU itself came out of the idea of power sharing. It was a partnership between the PNC and the WPA, essentially. And when they got into power, Mr. Granger, to his credit, floated the idea to the PPP of sharing power. And he appointed Moses Nagamoto to negotiate on behalf of the coalition. And the PPP said no. And the matter died there. People don't give Granger credit for that. Granger reached out. And the PPP said no. Now we understand why they said no. Because from the time the coalition came to power, they started to work on regime change. So they had no intention of sharing power. And now, with new resources, more resources, the question of sharing power raises its head again. Nigel Hughes raised it over the weekend. And very quickly, the loquacious guy, Anil Nandalal, said no. Jack Dio, a couple of years ago, about a year ago, he said no. Basically, what they're saying is that we do not intend to have a democratic Guyana where all of its people partake in decision making about how resources are distributed, in decision making about their lives. Sir Arthur Lewis, Nobel Peace Prize winner from St. Lucia, our Caribbean, as early as 1965, came up with what he called a new definition of democracy to suit countries like Guyana. He said democracy must mean that all those who are affected by the decision must participate in making that decision. He was moving the definition of democracy from what we call procedural democracy or formal democracy to substantive democracy. He was arguing that one person, one vote is insufficient democracy. That you must now ask the question, what outcomes do you have from one person, one vote? Do you have an outcome where all voters see their representatives making decisions on their behalf? On their behalf. And so the question of substantive democracy, what is the substance of your democracy, is what Arthur Lewis raised. What we have seen in Guyana in 3 years is that the coming of more wealth has not automatically led to the easing of the racial temperature. Many economists argue that. They say if you have more resources, then things like ethnic conflict decreases. What Guyana has shown is that as we get more resources, the ethnic problem increases. So we have we have in Guyana, our experience, in a sense, has proven that thesis invalid. So therefore, the question is, what do we do about power? My guests tonight are Vincent Alexander, who has been thinking about this subject. He was part of that PNC group that thought this thing through, came up with a proposal, in a sense, pushed their leadership to embracing it. So, Vincent, you can call him an expert on this. And Takuma Ogunseye of the WPA, which came out from its birth in 1979 for power sharing. They put forward a proposal called a proposal for a government of national unity and reconstruction. So in that sense, Ogunseye grew up with this idea. I said the idea was first floated in Guyana by one of the founders of the Working People's Alliance. So Ogunseye knows about power sharing inside out. So we have two people here tonight to talk about what has developed recently. That is, as we move into the petro-state era, is power sharing now more relevant than ever? And what now, as the opposition says that it still believes in power sharing, and the government, with 50% of the votes, says it does not? Where does that leave us? So let me bring in our guest tonight. Vincent, good evening, my brother.
Good evening. Good evening, David.
Brother Takuma, good evening.
Good evening, Dr. Hines, and welcome. Hello to your viewers.
And Vincent, as Fanny Lou Amos says, well, not Fanny Lou, I forgot the name of the American comedian, deja vu all over again.
Indeed, deja vu all over again. I think that's the best way to say it, because it is not something new. It is just an immediate response, an attempt to shoot down immediately without any discussion an idea which has been on the table for some time now. An idea which at one time the PPP even said they had an interest in, that's under Chetty J. Gunn, but which they have not showed any favor for since his demise. So indeed, it is deja vu. But I think a good place to start from in the current situation is the point you made earlier about Granger making the offer. And it's important to start there because Nandala's response is to say, look, we don't have any problem with power sharing, but these people are power grabbers. So was Granger being a power grabber and made the offer? So this exposes immediately Nandala attempting to call the call for power sharing a power grabbing exercise because they have rejected this offer when they were not in power. And therefore, it could not be a case of power grabbing when Granger made the offer. The second thing about power grabbing is on whose behalf was Nigel Hughes speaking. Nigel Hughes used to be the chairperson, if I'm not mistaken, of the AFC. Nigel Hughes, for all intents and purposes, has distanced himself from political office. And so his contribution was that of a citizen from the outside, looking into the political arena and suggesting what the problem is and how it can be resolved. And so how could one respond to Niger news with the contention that this is power grabbing? This is a government arrangement. This is a citizen who has done a critical analysis of the situation. And on that basis, is suggesting that this is the approach. And Niger might not have been one of those who have always, at least publicly, spoken to this question of power sharing. So it really exposes Nandalal in totality when, in his haste to knock down the idea, he first is power grabbing because there is absolutely no basis in the context of how this matter has emerged historically, in the context of the offer made by a government in power, the Granger government, even in the context of the talks that we had in 85, and I dare say the talks in 77 as well, if I'm not mistaken. In both instances, the PNC was in government, but did entertain those discussions. So that one cannot, from a historical perspective, and even from the contemporary present situation, contend that it's power grabbing. And therefore one has to treat this call of power grabbing merely as an attempt to find some reason where you don't take responsibility for not having power sharing and try to throw it on someone else.
Brother Takumo Ogunseye, your initial thoughts, deja vu all over again?
Yes, I mean, I was first drawn to Nandalal's statement by a WPA comrade Rohit Kanai. You know, we were speaking and he asked me whether I saw Nandalal thing. I said no. And then I went to Demerara Wave after our conversation ended, and I read it. And what struck me, you know, I don't know if it's because of my age. You know, nowadays, when you are lucky to live as long as I live, and then you have to reflect on political actors younger than yourself. It was the first time I ever went to check a politician date of birth. And I had to go to check Nandalal's date of birth. And I recognized he's a younger generation politician. And some of us have been in politics almost his entire life. But what I make this point to say that one would expect that younger generation politicians who have the advantage of the past, who have been able to see the weaknesses or the shortcomings of our major political actors, Burnham, Chedi, and who else we want to call, they've been able to see the shortcomings of their party because you know, the party is in power for a significant period in the country, is a major party and so forth, would have, you know, developed a more mature approach to this whole question of power sharing and don't reduce it simply to, you know, people just calling for it because the PPP is in power and because they don't want to face any elections. When the thing got a history, as you yourself and Vincent point out, a long history, longer than the life of Nandalal. And, you know, it raised the question right away in my mind, what is happening in the PPP? I mean, look, we know in politics there's some low blows, and we know in politics it's a very partisan business. But at the same time, as political people and people who are supposed to be concerned about your country, you don't want always to develop a kind of automatic reflexes to say everything in the PPP is negative. Okay, and speaking for myself, and I think it also, I could say, speak for WP on this. We tend to lean backwards to see whether in the major parties, both the PPP and the PNC, we look for newness. And we look to see whether, you know, those institutions are really throwing up the caliber of leaders who, whether we like it or not, will be responsible for the future direction of the country, because some of us are going off the scene. And Nandalal's approach to this matter pushed the PPP response to the very lowest in recent times. Now, in the controversy they had with me, where Jagdeo, Jagdeo is the powerhouse in the party, on sheer governance, he said there was not enough trust. And he did it on that point. But he went on to say that later in the year or early in the new year, there will be a constitutional reform process. And he said that if the people wanted that solution, they will live with it. And I think that was a significant statement from Jagdi, whether it's opportunistic or not, time will tell. But Nandalal returned the PPP to a very backward period, because the PPP for many years had embraced power sharing, but all they were making the point that we need to build trust. Now his approach is that there's no need for power sharing. Power sharing is just a power grabbing by a nasty, shameless opposition. And listen to his language, no statesman language, and I think that is what is more concerning. And this is taking place in the context of oil. We saw what happened in the context of independence when Guyana tried to avert a racial bloodbath, which he see was clearly in the horizon. Now we will have to be stupid not to understand that the kind of money we're talking about that will come to Guyana, that the stakes for ethnic confrontation over this money is even stronger than our confrontation in the independence period. And in the context of the way in which forces in the world who play oil states and oil countries to their advantage, they supply the weapons, they supply all kinds of things. Guyana need to quickly resolve this problem in order to put the country in the best place or in a better place to deal with the objective challenges that oil will pose to us. So when you read Nandalal, and if you take it to mean that his position is reflective of the dominant thinking in the PPP at present, Guyana is in a bad place.
Guyana is in a bad place. I put a comment on the screen from a PPP person who is on this program, and he or she makes trouble, but doesn't do it in the nastiest of way. And there's the question there: what does the Constitution say about power sharing? The insinuation there, I am sure, is that power sharing is not in the Constitution. So what are you all talking about? Vincent Alexander, I'm bringing you in here because you did play an important role in the last constitutional reform exercise. And as I remember it, power sharing was front, back, center of all of those discourses. And there was a compromise that went into the Constitution. But anyhow, I'm not giving more liberty because you were there. So you tell us, in response to the cynical question here about power sharing in the Constitution.
Well, first of all, let's accept that power sharing could be vertical and power sharing could be horizontal. And by vertical power sharing, we're talking about power sharing that takes place on the vertical axis of the organs of the state. So local government, central government, local government, regional government, central government. And when we talk about lateral, we're talking about taking place at one level across political entities. I say that to say that the way in which we coined the Constitution, notwithstanding the rejection of the idea of power sharing, it provides for a fair amount of vertical power sharing. If, in fact, our governance approach to local government concurs with good governance and the provisions of our Constitution. Because the way in which our local authorities are populated largely represents pockets of interest of the various political forces and in that regard of the various ethnic groups. So if in fact the local authorities were given real power to conduct local affairs, then you will have in some regards, let me call that even lateral power sharing. Because across local authorities, you have different parties in government, so to speak. And if those different parties in government are allowed the authority that the Constitution perceives that they should have, then in fact power will be shared laterally at the level of local government across the various parties. But it also would represent a vertical power sharing because it means that the government at the central level would not be hugging all of the authority. The authority would be devolved lower down. And in this instance, that devolution provides for what I just referred to, the lateral power sharing. So that's one thing that one should take into consideration. That this response by Nandalal is not merely a response to what Naidu says, but it's an expression of the conduct that has already taken place where there is a possibility, given the legal framework for power sharing. He is dismissing something which we have, in some regards, provided for. And all the actions taken by the government, starting with the president going down, where they refuse to have conversations at the local level with the local representatives, are expressions of anti-power sharing culture and conduct, because power sharing in some regards can be realized through those mechanisms. But having said that, when one looks at the Constitution, one can see that what was arrived at can also provide for power sharing. Insofar as we have a situation where what is declared at the end of elections in the first instance is the presidency. That's declared. The candidate of the party with the highest number of votes is declared to be the president. But the extent to which the Constitution does not provide for the winning party necessarily to form the government, and the president can, in fact, act in a manner that allows for a government that includes other parties, also speaks to the question of power sharing. Bearing in mind, for example, that we've had a situation where when the PPP came to the government, I think it was in 1997 or 2001, that the TUF joined the government. TUF joined the government. So that the point I'm making is that there is a mechanism that is in place if the government wished to, coming out of the way in which the Constitution is framed, to actually engage in a power sharing arrangement, even though power sharing is not itself mentioned in the Constitution. So anybody who says, well, look, this thing down in the Constitution can't happen, certainly does not have an understanding of what power sharing entails, and certainly cannot relate to a Constitution, which, though it does not specifically speak to power sharing, has put in place possibilities for power sharing if there's a political will. And I would go further to say in terms of the existence of a local government system, all of the laws in relation to local government system, if followed, would provide laterally the power sharing at the local level and for power sharing vertically insofar as central government will not have all of the power and much of it would be devolved to the local level. I'm not sure if we are faced with a connectivity problem.
Oh, sorry. I muted myself.
Notice
Before
David
I
is now
go,
coming back.
before I go to, are you hearing me?
Yeah.
Vincent, are you hearing me?
Activity in that regard.
Vincent, are you hearing me? There seems to be an issue there, Vincent.
I'm hearing you now.
Okay, good, great.
Did you
I said
hear me
before I
completely?
go. Yes, I heard you. You completed your thought, but you apparently weren't hearing me. Before I move to Takuma, Ralph Ramkaran, who you worked closely with during the constitutional reform process 2 decades ago, said on this program that Article 13 was a kind of compromise power sharing article that was put into the Constitution because the two major political parties, for whatever reason, couldn't come to a consensus of put power sharing in the Constitution itself. So Article 13 was a kind of compromise. In a sense, what he's saying in constitutional terms is inherent in Article 13 is the possibility of power sharing. Speak to that.
What I have said, in fact, inherent in the Constitution.
Right.
Article 13 is the possibility of power sharing. But I think Article 13, which speaks to the way in which one could, in fact, do allocation of, if I'm not mistaken, of the ministerial positions and things like that, clearly provides, without any reference to power sharing, for the possibility of actual power sharing.
Power sharing, yes. And I just wanted Miranda to know that if you're looking for I'm looking for the constitutional term that they use, but constitution power sharing is not stated directly in the Constitution, but Article 13 can be seen and is seen by the framers as the article in the Constitution that allows for power sharing. So although it is not an express power in the Constitution, that's the term I'm looking for, it's not expressed in the Constitution in a direct way, Article 13 allows or creates the framework, the constitutional framework for it. And the weakness of Article 13, of course, is that the Constitution does not allow for enforcing Article 13. And that is what a lot of people think is the weakness of Article 13. Vincent, you had something to say there?
No, not really. But I think you made a critical point there that the Article 13 is non-justiciable.
Right.
So that one cannot, one could enforce it, but one is not mandated to enforce it. It's discretionary.
Right. But courts have been known, especially in the United States, to infer from articles like Article 13 and make critical declarations. I mean, the 10th Amendment of the American Constitution says all powers not given to the federal government are reserved for the states. And the states have taken that, what they call the elastic clause in the Constitution, and stretch it. And the federal government has also used it to make some significant rulings that live with us to this day. I mean, the whole question of judicial review came out of consideration in that 10th Amendment of the American Constitution. But
in the case of Guyana, David, Um, you may recall that that article was used by uh, Justice Messiah when he was a lawyer.
Yes. Yes.
I think in the Timal
Yes.
case, that
Yes.
article was used. And he deemed it to be justiciable. And on
Yeah.
that basis, argued, he was in fact not a lawyer at the time, he was the chancellor.
Judge. Chancellor.
Mm-hmm. Yes. So what we did immediately after that was they went to the parliament and made a provision to say it is not justiciable. And that provision has been retained in the current constitution. So yes. That the creative judge is limited by virtue of what our legislators have done. Expressly saying that this provision, Article 13, is not justiciable. So although the government can reach out beyond its slate to include other people in the government in a manner in which they include Nadir, I think we ought to bear that in mind too, in which they include Nadir.
Yes.
Included Nadir. Restricts, I shouldn't say restricts, does not mandate that we take that approach. And therefore, people like Nandalal can simply ignore that and on the assumption that the populace are not sufficiently educated about our constitution to understand that some mechanisms have been embraced that may in fact lead to power sharing, even in the present context.
Yes. Carl, good evening. Yes, Carl, I'm aware that Miranda Brong is not Miranda Brong. You're saying Miranda Brong is Bara Jagdeo. Somebody saying you're giving Miranda a lot of credit there because, you're giving Jagdeo a lot of credit because Miranda is more intelligent than Jagdeo appears to be. Miranda, I know. We know that a lot of PPP people are on this program. One of them let it be known in a letter today, Mr. Clement Rohi, who let it be known that he listens to David Hines, Glenn Lal, Duncan, and Ben Shop, and so on and so forth. We know that they're on here. And just in case, Miranda Brong is a leading member of the PPP. You've learned something tonight. Yes, power sharing is inferred in the Constitution. Takuma, you have argued power sharing as a means, you and the WPA, but you in your personal capacity, you have argued that power sharing is a basis for racial peace. And you've argued from an African Guyanese standpoint that it is an essential ingredient in terms of settling our racial problem, but as far as African Guyanese are concerned, settling the question of power. Expand on that for us, please.
Okay, but before I do that, I want in you capturing the history of the power sharing struggle, you miss out the role of AGDA. I think for many years, AGDA have took a very strong and very active role in promoting the power sharing thing. And they were not interested in the party aspect of it. They were interested in the community aspect of it being a way of bringing African community to the political table, And I think that is important because even though I think the young PNC people had a lot of influence upon Hoyt and his decision when he eventually agreed to power sharing, I know AGDA, we had many meetings with Hoyt because there was a regular caucus between Hoyt and AGDA. And AGDA have put tremendous pressure upon Hoyt. And I think that played a big role in shifting Hoyt's position. From the very time this whole question of power sharing arose on the Guyanese political agenda. When I UC raised it, it was tied to the ethnic communities and trying to bring political justice to the ethnic communities. And we in the WPA have always maintained that. While we recognize it will be a device to empower political parties, but our major concern that, given the fact that our political parties are basically ethnic parties, any system that genuinely share power, and we were talking about executive power sharing, the end of the winner-take-all governance system, very clearly. We know what the Constitution, in the constitutional reform process, we did amend the Constitution in significant ways that improve it. But as everybody knows, we didn't touch the whole question of the winner-take-all governance. And when we speak about power sharing, we talk about executive power sharing and ending the winner-take-all system. The Constitution must be extremely clear that at the end of the day is racial consensus. Ethnic elections are racial consensus in Guyana. After the racial census, and we done both race and party, the Constitution said these forces must sit down, okay, and share the executive and run the country based upon whatever is agreed on in the Constitution. There is where we want the discussion to go. Because anything short of that, in my judgment, okay, would not survive to satisfy what objectively we're seeking to do. Because we want to remove the decision from a gentleman arrangement or arrangement based upon the goodwill of parties, because we have seen our parties have demonstrated historically, the major parties, that they got very little goodwill when they empower. So we want the Constitution to dictate the solution. And we are concerned, and I'm concerned, that the continuing winner-take-all system that politically exclude Africans and Amerindians and others from governance. And as you explained earlier, that governance and government determine who gets what, where, and when. And I am concerned, has always been, it got nothing to do even with oil or even with the PPP. As an African, I have always concerned about the history of my people, the 200 plus years of slavery, okay, and the lack of generational wealth we were paid not a cent, that Guyana is indebted to us. And at the minimum, we must legally, politically, constitutionally, economically, socially share Guyana equally with other ethnic groups. That for me is that is non-negotiable. Unfortunately, in the evolution of our politics, on our side, the PNC of, who after 64, when they were in charge of building the nation, emphasize the importance of nation and national building to the exclusion of African political and economic interests as an equal and necessary interest in the building of the new Guyana. So we did suffer some of that. But we all know that Guyana could not be a just place unless independence resulted in the correction of historical injustice to all Guyanese people, the indigenous people, the African people, the Indian people, everybody. That is what independence means. And to the extent that that is not happening, and whatever constitutions we frame in the past, and whatever the Constitution says at the moment, doesn't justify or prevent us having reflect upon the outcome of the Constitution, it doesn't prevent us from fighting for improvement in the Constitution and to end the winner-take-all system and having genuine sharing of executive power is an attempt to improve the Guyanese Constitution to make it more relevant with the historic challenge of independence. And then when you add that to oil and the dangers that the country objectively is exposed to and will continue to be exposed, a divided Guyana in the context of plenty, okay, we will have no excuse. Okay, this generation of politicians will have no excuse for if we fail to put Guyana, okay, on the road to power sharing at the executive level at the end of the winner-take-all system. We owe it to the next generation of Guyanese. And for me, if I had to go to war, I would go to war on that. As old as I be, if I'm going to die, I would die for that. That would be my sacrifice to the country and the next generation. Because I think it's extremely important. I am 71. I have seen what the winner-take-all do to me and my generation. We end up discussing the same problems that I was discussing at 16 and so when I enter politics in Australia. Some of the fundamental issues are the same. And is that we're going to pass on to another generation, which we haven't prepared, okay, to deal with the challenges of the world and the vultures outside there. It's a great disservice to the country. And I think that people like Nandalal who seems to believe that politics and power is something for the party or something for them because they are momental leaders, history will judge them seriously. But more important than that, we have a duty, this generation of politicians have a duty to knock sense in people like Nandalal, them head. That Guyana belongs to the PPP. Guyana belongs to no ethnic or no one party or no one ethnic community. And what would be Guyana's future would not simply be determined by what Nandalal want or what the PPP want or what the African community want or what the Indian community want. It's going to be determined by what we want collectively as a people, one way or the other. At different historical moments, certain historical groups and certain ethnic communities may be in a driving seat to drive the situation. And I will argue at this historical moment, it is the African community who have to drive Guyana, okay, on the road of constructive politics. That is our historical duty at this moment. It may change and other people may come forward later. But I think that we have to build this cat and build it soon.
Vincent Alexander, it's tough to follow that. But let me say what put Nandalal's abrupt statement in the larger context of the moment that we're passing through, the moment of oil resources, geopolitics. You and I were at a forum last Sunday, and we heard some of the frustration from the floor. I mean, in my closing remark, I tried to kind of put the frustration in context, but I had to admit that the frustration is real and it's necessary. In put what Nandalal has said there in the context of geopolitics, African Guyanese frustration, poor people frustration, ethnic competition, the question of crooked elections, and we have not even settled on what our electoral architecture should be. Put this statement in larger context for us.
Before I respond to that, I want to take the opportunity to reiterate that this whole question has arisen because of the plurality of our society and because of the presence of political parties that in the main represent one or the other of the ethnic groups. I'm saying that because the question of the plurality was one which I think was recognized at the very inception of the political struggle at the point of the late 40s into the 50s. And so there was a conscious effort when the PPP was being formed to bring together an Indian leader and an African leader. That wasn't a coincidence. That was consciously determined. And that could only have been so because they recognized the plural nature of the society and what could become of the society if there wasn't some kind of working together of the two ethnic groups. And they sought to do it via a party that would integrate those groups in its leadership and therefore speak for and speak to the entire population rather than one section or the other. So I think we ought to understand that because people like Nandalal seem not to understand that. Secondly, on the question of Borno, I would say that if Borno made a mistake, and probably it had to do with the circumstances of the time, was not to confront the issue frontally. But I think that Burnham, as a nationalist, but conscious of the state of the people of African descent, in some of his policies sought to confront the problem. And so I would think that the way in which he dealt with housing cooperatives sought to confront the problem. The fact that he moved to the point of what is called state capitalism, where this government, the state had control over the economy, gave him that leverage that is now being exercised by one party. Gave him that leverage to address the problem of the people of African descent, but not to the detriment of others. And I think we ought to always emphasize that. His housing policy, which sought to deal with people who didn't have the kind of capital and collateral, did not shut out others, but it appealed to the people of African descent, given their particular circumstance. So, whilst he did not at that time speak to power sharing, he certainly understood the plight of the people of African descent. And in many regards, even in terms of the way he approached education, it allowed for the people, for the masses, inclusive of the people of African descent, to be able to access education, as opposed to an elitist system which denied many education in the past. So that in his policies, he sought to confront what would have been the problem of the people of African descent. And so I don't completely agree with Takuma that the PNC did not. Burnham did, but I think what he did not do was to confront it frontally and to, from the standpoint of national policy, articulate what were the objectives he was pursuing in some of the things that he did. Having said that, I think we are faced with a serious problem now. We are faced with a problem where it is, I think, in many regards, class at play. Class at play in a configuration that is ethnic. What do I mean by that? That Indo-Guyanese control most of the economy. Most of the economy. And so what we have is a situation where they control most of the economy, and it is argued really control the party. Barrett may be the chief representative of that group of people. really control the party, is that we have an elite class of people who are using their position in the political and economic system to their own benefit, to the detriment of others, and more particularly to the detriment of the people of African descent who are not represented in any significant way in that elitist class. And that what they are doing in many instances is using race to assure themselves of power and control. And given the nature, the different cultures of the peoples of Guyana, and particularly the fact that the party is an Indian party and Indians would complain, do all sorts of things, and then vote for the party, they feel comfortable that they can continue to work in the interests of the capitalist class, so to speak, because there is no danger posed, given the way in which the Indo-Guyanese community is structured, and the fact that the Indo-Guyanese community, even in the face of exploitation, have demonstrated a commitment to ethnicity as opposed to a commitment to policies and programs. And this has to do a lot to do with the socialization that is taking place, starting from the coming of the Indo-Guyanese, the way in which they've been pitted against the Afro-Guyanese from a cultural and other perspectives, and the way in which this has been carried on in families, almost like trait. Now, it is that ethnic, that elite class that is now linking up with the capitalist class beyond the boundary. So basically what you really have is an alliance of internal forces and external forces perpetuating imperial rule, so to speak. An imperial rule which is no longer associated with kings and queens, but associated with the transnational oligarchy. So basically, we see the transnationals are the ones who have taken control of the world and collaborate with local elites in that process. And I think that is what we are suffering, where the transnationals are very much in charge, but they have an alliance with the local capitalist class, to the detriment of the ordinary people. But given some cultural factors, at the psychological moment, there are those who can live with it, notwithstanding the imposed poverty, but certainly it is an imposition of poverty and exploitation and degradation on the people of African descent, both from a psychological and a material perspective. And I don't think that this is something that can be maintained. People of African descent historically, from the period of enslavement right through, have shown that time will come when they can no longer live under the circumstances and may be forced, if the system does not provide for relief, forced to take their own action to realize that relief.
Brother Takuma, as we wrap up, the danger is Nandalal stands dangerous, and if so, why?
No, if I'm to go, it is dangerous because he. And I got two responses because I really don't know if Nandala really speaks to the PPP on this matter.
Assume because he's a leading member of the PPP.
You know,
so but I think assume that he speaks to them. They have not come out and rejected what he said.
Yes, yet. And they may never. they may never, you know. But what I'm trying to say is that looking at it at face value, he and the PPP is clearly trying to close the door on any solution that it will be reflective of any genuine sharing of power at the community, ethnic community levels and at the party levels. And if they continue along that line, they leave. When I speaking for the African community, I don't want to say the Americans say I ain't got right to speak for them. The African community would be forced out of necessity, okay, to find extra parliamentary and extra electoral solutions. You know, we can't play games with that. I mean, I know, and I don't believe saying that make you any radical. And in the history of the world, even Africa, where you got a racial problem, you got tribal, ethnic things, people the same root over money and oil and power, you know, behaving a certain way. And I don't know why anybody will believe the Guyanese are some superior species. We will succumb eventually to those negative behavior if our political leadership don't guide us, okay, on a better path. And Nandalal and the PPP's attitude to this question is dangerous because it's leave in the country on the road to confrontation. And once in a multi-ethnic society confrontation, you know, start, you don't have no full control of where it will go and how it will end. That is the risk you take. But if you have to take that risk, any civilized people will take the risk. And I think that the problem in Guyana is that this risk taking is becoming extremely critical for the Africans with a short window. Given oil and given the alliances, of course, we've always had internal and external alliances. But given the new arrangement and alliances with the oil and the oil money, the Africans can't wait for 20 years, 50 years, you know, some evolutionary thing about it. African political leadership has to make a conscious decision. Well, how much time we have, you know, in reasonable, in judgment that we could continue the politics we're continuing and come out in the best interest of the African community and the country. To me, that is one of the challenges facing African leaders, and we're going to be damned on the way we answer it. Our young generation going to damn we if we answer, because you can't avoid it. You can't tell people about all this oil money. We have a transformative thing, the nature, the PPP dominance, and all kinds of things. We explain the problem very clear. We're not lacking explanation of problems. Where we're lacking is the solution, and not arguing the solution, but enforcing the solution. And there is where African politics, and I would say Guyanese politics as a whole, you're not going to defend democracy simply by rhetoric. Until Guyanese are prepared to fight for the democracy and defend it with their bodies and everything that they have, democracy will be a joke in Guyana, especially now with the new oil wealth and the challenges that face us. Money gonna buy everything.
Takumo Ogunseye, weighing in there on the danger of Anil Nandalal's statement. We're going to continue the coverage of this issue. We're going to have a weekly thing. I'm going to try to have Nigel Hughes here and people like Henry Jeffrey and bringing back Vincent and others, because this question of the sharing of power has been raised and it's not going away. It has not gone away in 62 years. I don't think it's going to go away. I myself wrote a whole book on it, what I call it, Ethnopolitics and Power Sharing in Guyana, History and Discourse. And I've always planned to update it because I think it went up to about the 2000s or something like that. But clearly, it's an issue that has been put on the table, and I don't think it's going to go away at all. Vincent, thank you very much. Takuma, thank you all very much for kicking off the ball today, and we're going to continue long-term coverage of this issue. Thank you all very much. And to you, the audience, I can't say enough thanks to you, because I think some of these issues are complex, but more than that, I think some of these issues stretch your patience. You're asking yourself, what more do we need to see in Guyana to bring out the humanness of our political leaders? If nothing else, how can you look at where Guyana is and someone puts on the table again a way in which we can cooperate and share, and you knock that down? You're crazy, or you're suicidal. And the PPP has a game they play, and the game they play is they put Indian people belly pump plimpla. That is, they take these extreme positions, they force opposition to it. They then expect that opposition would be an attitude to Indian people. And then they go to Indian people and say, you see why you all have to stay with the PPP? Because the rest of the country is against you. I see the intellectual beginnings of that. You read a Randy Prasad, you read a Freddie Kissoon, and you can see them laying the intellectual groundwork for that kind of thing. They know that this advantage taking is not sustainable. But they're hoping that they can turn the opposition to it into an ethnic disturbance, an ethnic conflict. And then they then go to Indian Guyanese and say, you all are the victims. So they're prepared to use Indian Guyanese as collateral damage with the hope that they can then use it to maintain themselves in power. I see the intellectual beginnings of it, and putting Nandalal's response into that mix. We on this side of the fence have to have both an intellectual and an active response to it. I was a child in the 1960s. I grew up in the aftermath of the 1960s. I don't want that for Guyana. As radical as I am, I don't want that for Guyana. My studies of ethnic conflict, my observance of ethnic conflict around the world, it's one of the most dangerous forms of conflict. And I don't want that again for Guyana. And so therefore, I think it's incumbent on us to come up with a pushback against where the PPP is leading us. But that pushback must not throw Black people under the bus. We must fight for a political solution that is based on ethnic peace, but that peace must come as part of ethnic justice. Everyone is crying out for peace, but none of them is crying out for justice. I want a peace that is full of justice. So for us, it's about walking on the two planks, justice and peace. And if the PPP wants to walk on the plank of war, we have got to expose them and push back against it. Because they want to create a war in Guyana and then use us on this side as if we are the ones who are fomenting the war. That's the trick they're hoping to play in this country. And I am determined that we should not be caught in that trick. Everyone is crying out for peace, but none of them want justice for us is justice and peace. For the PPP is injustice and war. As we say, as little boys growing up, war break. War break between justice and peace, which we represent, and injustice and war, which the PPP represent. Tomorrow night, we'll continue this discussion.